Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Talks on the Rock. I'm Rebecca Albiani, and today's lecture is on the Studio Museum in Harlem. Now, early in the pandemic, one of the retirement communities that I lecture for frequently asked me to give a virtual visit lecture about New York museums. And so we did a kind of armchair travel thing. And when we were all locked down and no one could go anywhere, we went to New York City. And we went to the Metropolitan and the Whitney and MoMA. And then they enjoyed this so much that they had me go to London and Paris and Boston and Amsterdam. And my only criterion was that I would only visit virtually museums that I have visited physically in person. I'm making an exception today. I have not been to the Studio Museum in Harlem, but I'm making that exception for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's Black History Month, and this is the first American museum that was dedicated to the art of Black Americans. Secondly, no one can visit the Studio Museum right now. It is in the middle of a major reconstruction. So this is the building was, or the museum was formed in the late 1960s. This is the building that it was in from 1980 until 2019. And this is the architect's proposal for the new ambitious project that is being built in Harlem now, and which I couldn't find a firm opening date for. But as part of the fundraising, the Studio Museum gathered some of their finest works and sent them around the country. So the third reason I can do this lecture is that I did see the bulk of these works last year at the Frye Art Museum. So there was an exhibition called Black Refractions from the Studio Museum. As you can see, this old historic brownstone is going to be transformed into a very modern, state-of-the-art museum for art made by artists of African descent, wherever they may be living and working, whether that is in Africa, in the United States, African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, British artists of African descent. They are all within the purview of the Studio Museum. And you can see that in the architect's project, there is a flag flying, the flag that was also flying outside the previous incarnation of the Studio Museum, David Hammond's untitled African American flag that has become a kind of a symbol of the Studio Museum. You'll notice its form is familiar, but the white has become black in this Hammond's work. And he's using the colors of the Pan-African flag designed by Marcus Garvey back in 1920 and transposing them on the colors of our familiar American flag to make this African American flag with the black referring to the skin color, the red, of course, to the blood of countless generations of Africans, and the green to the bounty of the motherland of Africa. But it also reminds us of pop art and of the way that back in the 1950s, artists like Jasper Johns began to use the American flag as a motif in their art making. Now here's the architect, David Adjaye, and the curator, Thelma Golden, in the foyer of the Studio Museum before it closed. And behind them is a work of art that was created specifically for that space, a work by conceptual artist Glenn Ligon. Ligon is known for using words, very often classic pieces of African American literature, like Invisible Man. In this particular case, his Give Us a Poem refers to a time when Muhammad Ali, perhaps the greatest boxer of the 20th century, but also well known as an activist and a poet, was speaking at Harvard University. And someone in the audience called out, "Give us a poem." Ali replied with what may be the shortest poem in the English language, "Me, we." And yet it rhymes. It rhymes visually when we see it in Ligon's neon reinterpretation of it, with the M and the W mirror images of one another. And it has meaning. Me, we. It's about the individual and the collective, how without a me, there is no we. But without that we, there's not really a me either. This interdependency is what this work is about. And of course, Ligon recreates it in black PVC and white neon, black and white. So what seems like a throwaway from a long ago speech was and continues to be something resonant and something welcoming as you enter this space devoted to, yes, the individual, the artists, the visitors, but also that collective that is created by all of them. Now, the very first artist who was given a one-man show at the new Studio Museum in Harlem when it opened in 1968 was Tom Lloyd. And his is not a name that has become known in the history of art. I didn't know him until I started researching this talk. But he worked with lights, light bulbs, and reflectors, and here in all of these marvelous colors and shapes that are not dictated by the artist. So the curators can hang this work. When it was at the Fry, it was in a different orientation than it is here, and the lights blink. It didn't enter the collection until 1996, by which time the original motors had stopped working, and they had to reprogram digitally a pattern of blinking lights. But Lloyd was inspired by West Africa, by the energy of the streets there, by the energy of New York City, and modernity. And so this is a work of art that is constantly moving and changing as the lights change. It's also very modern in that it is made of novel materials, light bulbs, motors, plastic reflectors, and so forth, just as other artists from this period, like James Turrell, were working with aluminum or light bulbs fluorescent bulbs and so forth. This was not bought for the museum back in 1968. In fact, the first work to enter the permanent collection of the Studio Museum wasn't gifted to that museum until 1971. It was this Elzir Cortor painting, The Room, from 1949, which is a marvelous, enigmatic work which shows us a woman of African descent wearing a magnolia flower in her hair, as Billie Holiday famously did. She is silhouetted against, on the one hand, a red curtain, popular in Baroque art, and Cortor definitely knows his art history. You know, the Baroque is here, Surrealism is here, social realism of the 1930s is here. But we're not exactly sure where this woman is. Is she in that desperately poor scene on the left, that shack with newspaper or cardboard that is both used for decoration and for insulation to keep the wind out of the cracks between the boards? And is she dreaming of a successful career as, say, a singer? Or has she made it? Is she on stage with the red curtain and the red carpet and the red lipstick and thinking back to her humble origins? It isn't clear, but it is such a beautiful image. And the fact that the woman's eyes are closed make it that much more mysterious. Another work from that era is much simpler, Bill Traylor's Dog. Traylor is an entirely self-taught artist who was born a slave, and then once slaves were freed when he was about 12, he became a sharecropper and worked on the same Alabama farm for most of his life. And only in his retirement did he take up art. And in fact, in part of those years, he was a street person, and yet he made art on whatever he could. So this particular dog is on the inside of a cardboard packaging for a Hershey's chocolate. And Traylor's work was noticed by other artists and enthusiasts of folk art, and he even got a one-man show. But his work comes from his 70s and 80s, his late life, after a very hard life, and sometimes is whimsical like this dog, sometimes is about the horrors of slavery that he saw as a child. One of the most familiar artists in the collection, particularly to us in Seattle, is Jacob Lawrence, whose The Architect comes from 1959. And construction is one of Lawrence's favorite themes, something that he would work on from a young age until the end of his life. So here he is, a mature artist, showing us the Black architect in a period, the late 1950s, where it is just beginning to be possible for African Americans to pursue professional careers, to have success as architects, lawyers, doctors. And so we see the architect with his plans in front of him. He's at this enormous drawing board. His tools are there. And then out his window is the construction site, with the girders, with all of what is in his head becoming a reality. Just as with Lawrence's work, what is in his head, his vision for his art, is becoming a reality on his panels. But it's a wonderful image of the Black intellectual, of upward mobility for African Americans at this time, of what was possible. Now, some of the earliest works in the collection are the photographs of James Van der Zee from the Harlem Renaissance period. This is Van der Zee's The Midnight Ramblers from 1925, and it shows a group of musicians that reminds us of the critical role that Harlem played in the development of American music in the 20th century. Think of the Cotton Club, the development of jazz. And it also reminds us, as we look at this group of well-dressed, talented individuals, that Harlem was one of the only places that they could perform. They probably couldn't have performed in downtown New York, white New York, and they certainly couldn't have performed in the South in 1925. But in Harlem, there was this opportunity for burgeoning creativity of all sorts in the visual arts, in music, in literature. Now, Dawud Bay has been making photographs of his Harlem community for decades now. This is his Harlem, USA from 1976, a man in a bowler hat, and we can almost imagine that he was one of these musicians. He's still in his tux and tails, but he's 50 years older now, and yet it is important to him to look sharp, to continue to dress well, even when he's in these surroundings where the paint is peeling and poverty might be rampant. It is a positive view of Harlem, a Harlem tenement, whereas in 1968, Life magazine had Gordon Parks create a photo essay of a Harlem family, which included this Fontanelle children outside their Harlem tenement, which is a much grimmer view of Harlem tenement life. We see these children in this alley that is ankle deep in debris and garbage and cast off stuff, and they're there because they're latchkey kids, and we get this sense of a more grinding poverty and the intergenerational toll that poverty can take. From 1971 comes this very strange painting by Benny Andrews called Composition, Study for Trash. So even though this is a big painting, it's almost 8 feet wide, it was a study for a larger work. And it has to do with Andrews already in 1971 envisioning how our nation was going to celebrate the bicentennial, which was a lot of what public discourse involved in the early 1970s. And Benny Andrews was certain that the celebrations were going to be all about white Lady Liberty and the white founding fathers, and would whitewash the horrors of slavery and the inconsistencies on which our nation was based. And so Andrews made this series of images about the bicentennial, about the celebrations, where here we see the globe that is literally resting upon brown bodies. And we see America that is being pulled into being by black labor, enslaved labor, much of it. And we see the brown and black faces behind the scenes, but out there in the crowd, it is mostly white faces that are watching this whitewashed version of American history. Noah Davis's Black Wall Street from 2008 is another work that has surreal aspects, and it describes something or refers to something that in 2008 very few white Americans would have been familiar with, but which last year we had the 100th anniversary of, which was the 1921 Tulsa massacre of their prominent African American community, the prosperous neighborhood that was known as Black Wall Street. And so Noah Davis doesn't depict it directly, but gives us instead the ominous mood of some impending or recent disaster. We get what look like corpses or bodies there. We get this blimp thing or bomb shape in the sky which is black with clouds. It is a deeply disturbing image in which we imagine the violent acts. We don't see them. So a lot of what we think of as African American art has to do with race relations, has a social commitment to bringing those to light. We don't generally think of African Americans as abstract artists, although of course many of them are and have been abstract artists. So one of the prominent Black abstractionists that we will see when we visit the Studio Museum one day is Charles Alston, who in about 1960, as the civil rights movement was heating up, began a series of paintings that he called black and white, limiting his palette to those two colors, limiting his works to black and white and shades of gray. And of course, a number of white painters had also limited their palettes to black and white. Franz Klein is the most famous example. A lot of Willem de Kooning's work is black and white, really even a lot of Pollock's work. But when it is in the hands of a Black American, it's hard not to imagine this taking on some of the meaning of black and white, of society's opinions of race in our culture. And I was not familiar with Charles Alston, the abstract artist. I was familiar with the Charles Alston of some 20 years earlier, when he was commissioned by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, during the Depression to create murals for Harlem Hospital. This is his magic in medicine, murals which were recently restored, that had fallen into tremendous disrepair, but they were recently restored and then celebrated in this new glass facade of Harlem Hospital Center in a project, the restoration of these murals, that the Studio Museum was deeply involved with. Now, Hale Woodruff, rather than black and white, is using red, white, and blue for his palette in this painting that he calls Portal. And in summer of 1963, Hale Woodruff was one of the founders of an African-American artist collective called Spiral, with Charles Alston and Romare Bearden and Norman Lewis. And so this is a painting that he made about that time as they discussed the role Black artists should play in the civil rights movement. And so here, by using red, white, and blue, he is again addressing America in this kind of deconstruction of the American flag, which some people see figures in, others see as a completely abstract work. But in calling it Portal, it is a place to enter, whether that is being brought in forcefully as a slave, whether it is a place to enter the discussion as an immigrant, or a place for Black Americans to fully enter society, as was their goal. Now, not all of the members of Spiral turned to abstraction, and this is one of Romare Bearden's famous collages. Bearden was a Harlem dweller, but he also had family in North Carolina. So he had deep roots both in the urban and the rural worlds, and here he addresses the latter in this image of a farmer, but he collages together photographs from black and white magazines, other mediums, always the eyes in Bearden's work are collage, to give us this multi-layered and somewhat dislocated image of a Black farmer. Now, one of the most prominent American abstract artists of the 1960s and early 70s was Alma Thomas. And this is not representative of her work. This would be a study for a larger work, but always the Studio Museum's acquisitions budget has been limited, so they don't own one of Thomas's wall-sized abstractions, like the one that the Obamas had in the White House. They have just this small study where we get the colors that Thomas would use, but when she expanded this into a large-scale painting, each individual color, the blue, the yellow, the orange, the red, would be broken into patches of that pure color, almost like giraffe markings. That was her signature style, and she was living and working in Washington, D.C., and in fact, had been an art teacher in the D.C. public schools, and her career as an artist really begins when she retired from teaching art in her late 60s. She was able to devote herself fully to abstract art and become a really substantial color field painter. Another kind of abstraction was geometric abstraction, and that is what Alvin Loving was drawn to. This is his Variations on a Six-Sided Object from 1967. And Loving uses a frame within the frame, that black frame shape around the edges, that reminds us of abstract geometric artists like Joseph Albers with his homage to the square. But here, Loving delights in breaking that frame, in having his forms burst out of the cage that he has failed to trap them in. That also adds three-dimensionality to what otherwise might be a very flat work. So we perceive some of these shapes, like that peach one on the right, as being behind that frame. Others, like this violet one, as being in front of the frame and rather transparent, because we get, it darkens when it crosses the boundary of the frame, and so forth. And a six-sided object is what? A cube. So this is Loving working with literal cubism, reinterpreting Picasso's innovations from the early 20th century, some 60-odd years later, and finding that it is still a very vibrant way of working. Sam Gilliam is another Washington, D.C. area abstract painter. I apologize, I forgot to tell you to silence your cell phones, and I forgot to silence my own cell phone. Very poor form. I will make it stop now. So Sam Gilliam is like Alma Thomas, living and working in D.C., and like Alma Thomas, we consider him a color field painter. Like artists like Helen Frankenthaler and Morris Louis, Gilliam was thinning his paints dramatically and then applying them on unprimed canvas in such a way that he would achieve almost watercolor-like effects. So this is Gilliam's April 4, Part 3, 1968, which anyone from this era would have immediately known is the date of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. So this is, yes, a completely abstract painting. And yet it is also a painting that is reckoning with current events, with the violence that erupted after King's death that Gilliam could see from his studio window. He was living in a part of D.C. that experienced looting and arson and terrible riots after King's death that, of course, Gilliam felt King would have lamented. His message was all about nonviolence. And so Gilliam, this is a third in a series of paintings that he made with this title, April 4th, in 1968. So he is making this homage, this meditation on these tragic events of his moment. So he doesn't depict King's corpse, he doesn't depict bullets, guns, looting, rioting. Instead, it almost looks like a window into a blurred distance, or as if it's tear-stained, the way that he has such a liquid medium that he is working with here. And it's a very unusual shape, nearly 10 feet high, but only about this wide, and the edges are beveled. So it is 4 inches deep. It's canvas wrapped around wood to give it a real shape, a shape that suggests perhaps the lid of a coffin. So you can find a very interesting interview with Gilliam on YouTube where he talks about, he's asked by the interviewer, how abstract art can address current events. And he says that abstract art can make you question your assumptions. It can shake up your point of view. And in that way, it can get at some of the emotional content of current events that I think his April 4th series does so beautifully. Norman Lewis was very inspired by Black music, particularly jazz, and he calls this work Blue and Boogie. He uses black and blue as his palette here. Of course, black and blue has a particular meaning in American English vocabulary, meaning beat up, bruised. But this is a work where you can almost hear the horn and get that kind of centrifugal energy out of the jazz or the blues that we can imagine him listening to in his studio. A more recent piece of abstract sculpture is Chiara Booker's Repugnant Rapunzel, Let Down Your Hair, from 1995, an abstract sculpture that is made largely out of tires, with some screws and metal parts fastening them together. Of course, it's referring to Rapunzel, that fairy tale of the dimmest princess who would let down her hair for the witch and then for her lover, the prince. And being black and rubber, Booker is referring to the hair of Black women, the complicated braids that women of African descent often use, to African ideals of beauty that are sometimes seen as repugnant in the West, but also deeper than that by using black rubber. She is alluding to an industry that in the 19th century despoiled the Congo, raped the natural resources of the heart of Africa for European profit. And so she's referring to this dark history of the very material of rubber. So this is an abstract interpretation of Black women's hair. Here we find Barclay L. Hendricks' Lawdy Mama from 1969, a portrait of his cousin, where she wears this very proud afro. And this is such an interesting painting. I knew Kahinda Wiley's works with gold ground, but not Barclay Hendricks, that come from about 40 years before Wiley started exploring gold grounds. And he is elevating this ordinary, beautiful young Black woman, but an ordinary woman, to the status of sainthood by placing her on the gold ground in the arched format that was used in Western religious painting, by turning her hair, her afro, into essentially a halo. Even the title, Lawdy Mama, which uses African American vernacular, it's religious. It refers to the Lord. And it's just this fabulous image. So that brings us to African American portraiture. Titus Kaffar is influenced, as Wiley had been, by Barclay Hendricks. And this is from his Jerome series. He had begun a couple of years earlier searching for his father's prison records. He was largely raised by a single mother because his father was incarcerated, and he found dozens of men with his father's first name, Jerome, and even some with his father's last name. And so he began making portraits of these men, sometimes using they're mug shots or shots that people put online as the basis of his portraits. And he puts them on that gold ground that sanctifies them, but then he dips the portraits in tar to represent their time in the penitentiary system, their time incarcerated. And so this is his way of addressing the repression, the silencing of so many young black men, their sentence, the harshness of their sentencing, under 3 strikes in particular. And all of these are based on police mugshots, portraits of men named Jerome that were in the legal system. Some of them cover the mouth so they can't speak. Some of them, the tar goes even further and they can't breathe. Beaufort Delaney was a lifelong portraitist who found racism in the United States so debilitating that he moved to Paris. He was not only black, but also homosexual. So 2 strikes against him in the New York art world of the 30s or 40s. And so he spent most of his career working in Paris. He was friends with expatriate American writers like Richard Wright. And this is his portrait done late in his career of a young musician, someone else who has come to Paris, perhaps to escape racism, or is, just a European of African descent who is posing for Delaney, who seems to be entertaining him based on the smile that plays around the young man's lips. And I just love this, the brilliance of the colors, the wonderful use of line and contour here, but also this young man at the beginning of his career, painted by a master near the end of his career. Another sort of portrait from the exhibit is Isaac Julien's Incognito, Melvin Van Peebles, which is an absolutely life-sized mock-up, recreation, very, very lifelike, of the great black film director, Melvin Van Peebles. And this was actually used as a prop in a film that Julien was making about Van Peebles. But it is this characteristic gesture. He's dressed sharp. He's in his suit and his fedora. He's got his ever-present cigar in his mouth. His shoes are shined, and it looks like he's out on a street corner, like you could almost bump into him and ask him for directions. But he's the typical flaneur in the 19th century Parisian term that artists like Manet used, the walker and watcher, the man who would wander the streets of Paris, always observing, always with an eye open. And like Delaney, Van Peebles moved to France and lived in Paris through much of his career for the same reasons of racism that they found in this country. Lynette Bowman's Nous étions is another kind of a portrait, and if her name looks familiar, if you know that fabulous painting of a ballet dancer in Sam, it is also her work. But Nous étions is a portrait of a young black man with a scraggly goatee, with three-quarters view out at the viewer, and her shtick is to create every one of her oil paintings in a single day. So this is done quickly. It has something of impressionist touch about it. It is immediate in its connection with the subject. It has to happen very fast if she's going to get this all done in a single day. It is part of a remarkable body of work. And now a somewhat different sort of portrait is Faith Ringgold's Echoes of Harlem, which is a series of painted portraits, painted on acrylic, that are then painted with acrylic on canvas, that are then pieced together into a quilt. She made this with the help of her mother, who was a successful fashion designer in Harlem, an extraordinary seamstress, and quilting is part of the African-American woman's heritage in our country. And so it draws upon this communal activity of Black women. It is made communally with her mother, but it also has all of these paintings that are taken out of the frame and instead placed into a bed-sized quilt. And Ringgold calls this Echoes of Harlem. She lived in Harlem and taught in public schools in Harlem for the better part of her life. In fact, Ringgold is still alive and turning 92 this year, but this was her first quilt. She would become best known for her story quilts. This is where they got started, in this mosaic of different skin colors, of different facial types, different facial hair, hair types, jewelry, that she would find on the streets of Harlem. So she's looking at particular hairstyles, whereas Elizabeth Catlett, in this work from late in her career, is looking at not individuals, but representative types of the mother and child. Now, Elizabeth Catlett was a printmaker who moved to Mexico City in the 1940s, again dismayed at the racism in our country. She would be very involved with a Marxist print collective in Mexico City, because of which she was blackballed by the State Department. She actually had to give up her American citizenship in the 1960s. She became a Mexican citizen, and she increasingly turned to sculpture later in her career, but she wasn't able to attend a major retrospective of her work in the 1990s because she wasn't able to get a visa because she was persona non grata. But this is a beautiful example of her late sculptural work. It is life-sized, 68 inches high, taller than I am, and it is mahogany. So it is naturally brown in its skin tone, but it seems more universal than particularizing in its depiction of this bond between infant and mother. This is something that transcends skin color and is one of the most important subjects in the history of Western art. Now, Leroy Clark's Now from 1970 has raised fists and broken chains, and this is definitely a work about the Black Power movement, the worldwide African-American struggle for equality, and it was painted shortly after Leroy Clark came to New York from his native Trinidad and Tobago. Which had only had independence since 1962. This is the work of an artist who was an avowed, self-declared revolutionary. It has imagery from African masks, breaking of chains, this force for change. Leroy Clark would be one of the first artists in residence, which has been a hugely important program at the Studio Museum that would invite each year 3 artists to spend a year being an artist in residence, living in Harlem, interacting with the museum community and with the community as a whole. And this has been a star-making turn for a number of artists. So it is only emerging artists that are favored by this opportunity. One of those in the 1980s was Carrie James Marshall, whose Silence is Golden is very characteristic of this moment in Marshall's career. It's before he developed his signature way of depicting African Americans, which is still very, very Black, but allows for a little bit more visible modulation of the form, whereas here, everything is almost lost except for the eyes and the teeth. And just the outline of the hand. So this is a really enigmatic and rather disturbing painting. And Marshall, who is one of our finest painters, would say that he wants his work to be unequivocal. This is about Black people. This figure is Black, and therefore he paints it black. But that means that it also disappears in a way. And at about this time, he also made a work that he called Invisible Man, that is about the disappearance in American society of African American men, their erasure, essentially, from our society. We have the Red Cross in the upper corner. This is an emergency, and yet this man is urged, or is urging us to be silent. It's such an interesting work. Another artist who was awarded an artist in residency at the Studio Museum and has gone on to great fame is Kahinda Wiley. And so he was a 2001-2002 artist in residence, at which time he painted this work in his Conspicuous Fraud series, #1, Eminence. And this, too, is a work about the Black man in American society, but this young man is on Wall Street, or he's dressed to work in the halls of power and wealth. And yet the title, Conspicuous Fraud. He has imposter syndrome. He believes, and others perhaps feel immediately on seeing him, that he does not belong in that sharp Armani suit because he has the wrong hair. He has the wrong skin color. And here it's the hair that turns into this nightmare of locks that grow out of his head and then entangle him. Rapunzel comes to mind here as well, that are almost like smoke that are encircling him. It is a fantastic image of this liminal position of the Black professional. And this, again, is before Wiley hit upon his signature style of street casting young men whom he would have pose in their ordinary clothes in the guise of old masters. The following year, Mickalene Thomas was the artist in residence, and this is her Panthera. She was working in rhinestones at the time, and in this image, which is clearly a female panther, as the title tells us, we get notions of power and sexuality. Thomas has described the panther as a symbol of Black female representation, as something dangerous but beautiful. But this is also a Black panther. This can't not allude to the Black power movement. And in fact, Thomas's work is deeply rooted in consciousness of the civil rights movement. Jordan Castille, who was a later artist in residence in 2016, made this image of Kevin the Kite Man, who was a local figure. So part of the goal of the artist in residence is to immerse the artist in the community of Harlem, in the street culture, and here he picks this guy who was often in the courtyard across the street from the museum, flying kites, bringing beauty and joy to the world, depicted here in this painting. Now, these are emerging artists who are honored with this residency. Someone like Betty Sarr, who was already a mature artist by the time the museum opened, would not get so honored. In fact, her daughter, Allison Sarr, was one of the later artists in residence, but this is one of her works in the museum that is called Window of Ancient Sirens, and that has a number of images of powerful, mythical female beings, but in the center, King Tut's mask, and the fascination that our nation felt in the late 1970s as the King Tut exhibit was touring America, and a lot of African Americans were really identifying Egypt and Egyptian art as Black art. Lorraine Ogrady's Sisters 4 from her Miscegenated Family album takes on contrasting her own family, photographs of her own family, and photographs of ancient Egyptian artifacts. And it is an homage to a memorial to her sister, Devonia, who died young. So this is Devonia's sister, the artist herself, probably her high school graduation portrait, and Nefertiti's sister, because she felt that her sister, Devonia, looked like Nefertiti, the great the queen of the 18th dynasty. And so she did this series of comparisons that has us think about, yes, there are some parallels between the way Mut Nejmet looks and the way Lorraine Ogrady looks, and the lips, in the the flattening of the nose, and so forth. but also Egypt as a place of miscegenation on the Mediterranean, but on the continent of Africa, and a light-skinned white person as having had forced upon them by slave owners such miscegenation as well. There's a lot of such conceptual art in the collection. Fred Wilson collected racist objects that depicted African Americans in stereotypical ways, like this waiter who he attaches a globe to. He calls this Atlas, and on the globe, the black dots are areas where there's a largest concentration of very dark-skinned people of African descent, but he's also imagining black labor holding up the world. Whereas David Hammons, in his Too Obvious, shows us a piggy bank that has been broken open to reveal cowrie shells, which were the medium of exchange in Africa, the place from which slaves were stolen and brought to our shores, and how they were then had to be subjugated to capitalism, to a completely different kind of exchange. And that broken piggy bank suggests some of that. So it's a very complex image made out of really two simple parts, a piggy bank and some cowrie shells. Cowrie shells were also used as adornments as beads or in braids, and Corey Newkirk's Solon 612 is made out of plastic beads, the kind of beads that are worn in the braids of African American women. And Solon is Newkirk's hometown in New York State, and this is a kind of a landscape, the very evocative, rather abstract landscape. We get the sense of a cliff, clouds in the background, but it is entirely made up of beads strung on artificial hair, like a bead curtain from the 60s, but he was inspired by Venus Williams at the US Open a few years earlier, where the press criticized Venus Williams' beaded hair as a distraction for the other players, which is, of course, coded racist language. Why can't you have normal white hair? And so that got Newkirk thinking about those beads as a sign of identity and using them in his own art. Adia Millett here makes images of traditional markers of black masculinity. The pork pie hat, the Popov bottle, the menthol cigarettes that were marketed to the African American community, and of course a gun that is pointing at a rose that might be in a buttonhole of a dandy, but might also be on his coffin when he has died from gun violence or alcoholism or the effects of smoking. And since you can't see it well in this image, here is a detail. This work is cross-stitch. So that's a detail of those briefs, another marker of African American masculinity done in this most feminine of craft techniques of cross-stitch. So I know I'm over time. I'm just going to skip through a couple of images very briefly. I haven't looked at a lot of African artists, but Wangechi Mutu is a Kenyan artist whose chocolate Nguva is bronze, not chocolate, but draws on the mythical creature of the Nguva, which is a kind of an African mermaid or water woman, but is thought to be derived from the dugong, a very endangered relative of the manatee. And here we get ideas of female power and beauty, but also the complexity of our relationship to the environment, which Maren Hassinger also explores in her River. She says she is inspired by nature and natural forms, and so here we get the serpentine forms of a river, but they are made up of chains and ropes, and cannot fail to reference slavery, the Middle Passage. People brought here in chains and in ropes and forced, at the end of a whip to labor in the states around the Mississippi. So it's a work that has both hopefulness in its derivation from the natural world, but also carries the burden of this history. But I wanted to end with Henry Taylor's How I Got Over, which is an image from an archival photograph of high jumper Alice Coachman, the first Black woman to win an Olympic gold medal in 1948. And that's How I Got Over is a song that was sung by Mahalia Jackson to introduce Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. So here we find that dream, that overcoming of obstacles, in this case, the high jump, the possibilities and dreams for African American people. And what I hope our trip to the Studio Museum in Harlem has taught us is that there is no one way to be a Black artist. You can, as a Black artist, address the evils of slavery, of Jim Crow, of modern racism, of the prison system, of police violence. You can address all of those ills. You can be a socially committed artist. You can be an abstract artist whose art evokes feelings, perhaps, about such things, or just explores color and form in a way that all artists of any color are allowed to do. You can work in any possible medium, from the very traditional bronze to the very atraditional plastic beads used in hair braiding. And you can chronicle despair, and you can evoke hope. And the Studio Museum brings that multifaceted panoply of ways of being a Black artist to its public, or will, when it reopens again in Harlem. Thank you. So I apologize for going long, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
We do have a microphone in the back, so our live streamers can hear as well.
Okay, there's a microphone in the back if anyone wants to walk to the microphone and ask a question. I can hear you, and I can repeat your question. So does Seattle Art Museum have pieces by Jacob Lawrence? Yes, in fact, Seattle Art Museum does have some works by Jacob Lawrence. It has quite a few of his prints, but it also has some original work, since he did live and work in Seattle in the later years of his career. And the Seattle Art Museum also has a work by Carrie James Marshall. I'm pretty sure we have, I know we have a Wiley. I'm pretty sure we have a Mickalene Thomas. We have that wonderful ballet dancer by Lynette. I can't pronounce her last name very well, but Yiadom Boakia. So we also in Seattle do have examples of some very fine African-American artists' work. So thank you for the question. Is there a question at the microphone? No, I think our students just had to go because I went too long. But I'm so glad they were here. We had actual students here, young people in the audience. Are there any live stream questions? Well, if not, thank you all so much for coming with me on this visit to the Studio Museum. And I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you will add it to your list of Manhattan museums the next time you are in New York City. Thank you so much.